You're listening to the Stable Management Podcast, where we discuss the barn management topics that you're passionate about.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Stable Management Podcast. Our goal is to bring you a real-world look into the parts of horse farm management that you love or hate most, such as stall bedding, farm equipment, and pasture maintenance. During each bi-monthly episode, we'll be joined by an expert guest who shares their experiences with and perspectives on an important stable management topic. This episode is brought to you by MaxiGlow Stabilized Rice Bran. The rice bran horse owners prefer is a superior performance supplement specifically formulated for horses. MaxiGlow is available in both pelleted and meal forms and is high in fat and protein, packed with antioxidants, controlled starch, and is very palatable. Right now, ManaPro is running a promotion for $5 off MaxiGlow, and the coupon is valid until December 31st, 2024. Please visit mannapro.com/promotions/max-e-glo to take advantage of this offer. I'm your host, Hailey Kerstetter, and my guest today is Paula Hitzler, manager of the Michigan State University Horse Teaching and Research Center. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me.
I'm excited to jump into this topic. We'll be talking about horse herd dynamics, which there's lots to talk about, so we'll jump right in. And I'm wondering if you could explain herd dynamics to someone who's maybe never heard of that term before.
Well, I would think of herd dynamics as kind of the social hierarchy in a horse herd. So you have a horse or maybe a couple of horses that are more dominant than other horses. These hierarchies are not very static. They can change as horses are taken out or introduced. So it's usually you have one or two that are the boss of the herd.
Awesome. And can you explain what that hierarchy might look like with horses and how they could develop that amongst themselves?
Well, typically you'll have maybe one that's more dominant, and there's some feeling that this obviously starts out in the wild where you've got usually a mare that is the most dominant in the herd, and she kind of directs the herd to water and to food. So these horses domesticated horses still have this instinct to do this. And whichever horse is dominant can be dominant for a variety of reasons. It could be age, although in a herd of yearlings, you'll still see one that's more dominant than the other. So that horse that is dominant may just be a personality trait for that horse, that it has a tendency to be the more dominant in a group.
Very interesting. So if you have horses who are more dominant, maybe out in the pasture with their friends when humans aren't really interfering a lot, do you ever see those behaviors come out when the humans do interact with them, whether it's like, you're throwing hay to the group in the field, or even when you bring them inside to, say, ride or groom them or something like that?
Absolutely. So this is where understanding the group dynamics is very important. Feeding time, for instance, if you're taking hay, or we feed our horses here in bunk feeders, that you need to be really careful because the most dominant horse is typically the one that wants to get to the food first. And that dominant horse can be more aggressive to the other horses in the herd. And if you're out there with that group, you really need to pay attention to your surroundings and understand body language of horses so you don't get stuck in a tussle with these horses and you just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. So, and the same thing goes if you're going into a group of horses, and let's say all these horses come into the barn at night for a feed, the more dominant horse typically is going to be the one that wants to be caught first. So if you're catching the other ones first, this dominant horse could be more problematic with the rest of the group and put you in some harm if this horse wants to be caught first and you're not catching it first.
Yeah, I've definitely been in that situation. I can remember distinctly one of my very first jobs was to help feed a group of lesson horses that lived out together, and they would come into a stall, so you had to catch them each, but you had to catch them in exactly the right order. And if you did it regularly, you knew what the order was, and it was no problem. But if you had a new person out there, it could really become an issue because there were probably 6 horses that knew exactly what order they came in at, and they were the first horses to come in. And if you messed up those few, you were in trouble.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think a lot of, at least I know for my students, is we have to teach novice people how to read the body language of these horses in a group because they may not understand or notice all the red flags that these horses are giving to each other in order to keep the rest of the group away from maybe the one that wants to be caught. And so students sometimes don't understand what that language is that these horses are giving out and put themselves in the wrong place.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting if you ever watch like a video of a group of horses in a herd. I don't know why I came upon these, but I've seen videos online of just a group of horses interacting, and they might slow down and show you the slow motion version of the video, and you catch so many more behaviors than you might if you were in person or even just watching the video at regular speed. I think that's such an interesting like learning tool for myself to see how these horses interact and watch it in slow motion and really catch on to even the most subtle behaviors.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they can read each other's language, but we just may not know that instinctively. So I think people need to point that out. And there are a lot of subtle body movements and facial expressions, ears and tails and posturing that these horses do that would very easily just be missed by the novice horse person.
Yeah, absolutely. So that kind of brings me to the common social behaviors that we might see. Can you discuss some of the most common behaviors that we would see in horses that live out with a group?
Well, typically, if a group of horses get along well, even if you've got dominant and submissive horses, if they get along well and they understand the group dynamics, so that group stays the same, there's not a lot of introducing new horses or taking horses out, is you'll see them get along pretty well for the most part. They kind of know who is the boss. But that group that gets along, they'll stand head to tail and fight flies from each other. They'll know where to eat. So we group feed. So it's interesting to see the more dominant horses come up first, and then everybody else kind of has their place along these bunks. And if the group of horses stays consistent, they get along very well. And so fighting flies might be something they do, mutual grooming, standing closer when it's cold, are all good behaviors that see in a well-established group of horses. Now, that can all change the minute you maybe take one out and they have to reestablish their little pecking order, or if you introduce a new horse to the herd, then that kind of might mess up that whole that group dynamic, and it may have to kind of work itself out again.
Yeah, it's so interesting how when you remove one horse, how the others kind of sometimes don't know how to act. One of my good friends has a small herd at home, and he took out the boss mare to go to a show just a few times throughout the year. And every time he takes her, they're not really sure what to do. They're like, okay,
Yeah.
where's our leader?
Yeah, absolutely.
So something that we see pretty often is bringing the horses into the stall, whether it's for just part of the day, or even just for a few hours to ride or something like that. Does spending time in the stall and being away from the group for that short period of time affect how horses interact with one another when they are together?
I've not noticed it affecting it on a very short term, unless the horses left in the pasture are very attached to the one horse. So if you have, let's say, a couple horses that are very attached and you remove one, does that now get the horses in the pasture anxious, or the one that you're catching anxious because they've left the group, kind of herd bound type of horses? Where I've seen it more times is, let's say, kind of an example for us, we had a 2-year-old gelding that came in, needed orthoscopic surgery. So he was taken out of his little group of fellow 2-year-olds. And he was away from them for about 3 or 4 months. Now, finally, he got the go-ahead to put him back into the herd. And so it was interesting. This little group of 2-year-olds has been together since they were weaned. and had a nice cohesive group. In fact, they'd all eat one feeder and then they'd all go to another feeder and then they all go to the third feeder. They wouldn't split up at all. So he went out there and he was like the new kid on the block all over again. And you could see some tussling and some smelling and some striking and some tail tucking. And that kind of worked itself out in an hour or so. And now you would not know the difference. Like he's back in the group again. So I think it kind of just depends on your herd. Some groups of horses are very herd bound, very close to their buddies. And when one is removed, it upsets everybody. And then some, if they're taken out for longer periods of time, I think there is a whole new reestablishment of their group dynamics.
Yeah, I have horses at 2 different locations. So I have 2 pasture pet ponies that are very attached. They don't want to do anything separately. And then I have a thoroughbred at another barn who goes out with an older horse who's blind. And it's very interesting to see how the ponies are so attached. They spend time with only those 2 and they love each other. And then my other horse, who sees other horses during the day and then he goes back out with his friend at night, doesn't really seem to care very much about his pasture buddy.
Yep.
This episode is brought to you by MaxiGlow Stabilized Rice Bran. The rice bran horse owners prefer is a superior performance supplement specifically formulated for horses. MaxiGlow is available in both pelleted and meal forms and is high in fat and protein, packed with antioxidants, controlled starch, and is very palatable. Right now, ManaPro is running a promotion for $5 off MaxiGlow, and the coupon is valid until December 31st, 2024. Please visit mannapro.com/promotions/max-e-glo to take advantage of this offer. So what are some behaviors that we humans typically see as negative in our horses, but are actually normal and healthy behaviors for them?
So negative behaviors that horses might exhibit toward other horses might be, different body postures. So let's say a lower head and neck, and let's say kind of slinking that neck out in front of them, maybe turning their hindquarter quickly toward another horse with their tail tucked, maybe even raising their head up with their ears pinned back, or different smelling each other's noses and then squealing and striking. So those are all normal behaviors, and they have to go through that to establish who is going to be the more dominant one. And they usually don't hurt each other. It's usually just they kind of understand what that body language means, but it looks very negative to us.
Yeah, I've seen even I watch a lot of videos about like dog behavior as well, and I see the same thing. I don't know if they say the same thing in horses, but in dogs, they might say, this one's correcting that one. And both dogs seem to understand it's just a correction. It doesn't escalate. And then they act completely normal afterwards. But as humans see, another animal correct someone and we're like, oh my gosh, it's time to intervene. This is concerning. But Really, it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah. What's interesting is when you raise orphans, and I've raised several orphans, and if those orphans aren't raised by a nurse mare or taught that horse language by other horses, it is really interesting to see how they interact with other horses displaying what would be normal behavior, in especially normal introductive type of behaviors, as they don't read that language, they don't understand it. And it's really fascinating to watch a foal that's not been raised by another horse now having to figure that out. It can be challenging on them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you see like more pushy behaviors from them or more dominant type, or are they typically more submissive when they've had that type of...
From my experience, they're very submissive because, for instance, we had this one orphan and we didn't have a nurse mare, and I didn't have other mares that were nice to this foal. So he was almost a yearling before we introduced him to other yearlings. And they would come up and they would smell each other's noses and do the typical, hi, how are you kind of behavior. And then they would kind of whirl around, and he didn't even know he needed to move out of the way. So he got kicked a couple of times until he figured out that smelling and them turning really quick with their tail tuck meant he better move away.
Right.
He just didn't get it. And it took him a while to start to read that language that the other horses were expressing. But, we would think that, they're born, they know this, and they don't. They're taught this by their mothers or by other horses.
That's so fascinating. I've never really thought of it that way because I think we always just, expect a foal who's been raised normally with its mother, and then it behaves like a normal horse. But you don't really see the role that the mother might play until she's not there.
Exactly.
Are there any red flags that barn managers should be on the lookout for when they have horses living together in a group that are truly dangerous?
Well, I think, when you have a group of horses and you're group feeding them, whether it's just you're bringing hay out to them or you're feeding like we're feeding in long trough type of feeders, is feeding time can be a little scary, and you really need to watch the group. Your dominant horses, if they want to get to the feeder first, they might have some threatening behavior toward other horses, and we don't want to be in the way. So paying attention to the herd is very important for our safety. And as we discussed a second ago, catching up those horses in the order in which the horse feels the need to come in is important, or else they're going to charge over the top of you. Or as you're catching a quiet horse, push that quiet horse away because they want to be caught. So understanding and being aware of those dynamics are important. Now, managing a horse in a herd from a feeding perspective is we have to look out for, are all the horses in this group getting equal amounts of feed? So having adequate area for all the horses to come and up and eat, making sure those submissive horses are getting up to eat, and that the assertive horses or the more dominant horses aren't eating too much. So trying to maintain a pretty consistent body condition score throughout your group can be a little bit challenging. So if you're finding you've got a dominant, really fat horse or a submissive, skinny horse, you're going to have to do some resorting of the horses in that grouping to make sure that everybody is about the same body condition score and having access to feed.
Yeah, that's super important, especially as we start to enter the colder months. It can be, I think you can really see which horses aren't getting, say, when you have to throw hay in the field because there's not enough pasture. You can see which ones are kind of getting bumped away from the hay piles.
Mm-hmm.
So I mentioned a little bit ago about my minis who are very attached, and then my other gelding who doesn't really seem to care so much about his friends. Is there a reason why some horses bond with others while other horses might not?
From what I understand, I don't think we really know. I mean, we see some things, maybe horses are more preferential to, excuse me, other colors of horses in the herd, maybe. I think your age groups are interesting. They seem to hang out with each other, your young horses versus your old horses. So I think we really can say definitively what attracts one horse to another horse. Might just be they've lived longer together, and then we've introduced new horses to that group. So I don't know if I have a good answer for you.
That's really interesting that color might affect it. I find that very fascinating.
What's interesting is I will put, I'll have mares that have had daughters, and eventually those daughters are put in the broodmare band with their mothers. And you would think that they would know each other and hang out with each other. And in my experience, they don't. So I don't know why that is, but I find that interesting that even sisters and mother-daughters don't hang out with each other necessarily.
Do you find the same situation with geldings? Say if it's like, I don't know if you guys mix your herds, but if it were like a mare and a gelding out together and that's her son, do they seem to spend time together?
No, I haven't seen mares that have had their foals grow up and live in the same pasture. really hang out with them. The exception would be those mares that have had foals and that foal was never weaned.
Right.
So I had an experience where an outside mare came in for breeding and she was 9 years old and she was weaned at 9 from her mother.
Oh,
Now,
wow.
granted, she wasn't nursing anymore, but the bond was there, and it was very challenging for that mare to be away from her mother or be away from that farm. And it was very, very challenging for that outside mare.
Yeah, I can imagine that would be very stressful for her.
But as far as geldings and mares, I've had geldings that have lived with mares that kind of take this little group of mares like it's his own little band of mares. So that can present some problems if you've got an assertive gelding that kind of wants to herd these mares away from other horses. I have had that before, and we've had to change that dynamic because that didn't work out very well. It wasn't very safe.
Yeah, for sure. Do you see more issues with the mixed herds of mares and geldings versus if you had herds of the same sex?
In my experience, it seems to work better with horses of the same sex. However, I have commingled geldings and mares and have had that group get along quite well. I think it might depend on your individuals. But I guess if we were going to make a generalization, I would say let's just put mares with mares and geldings with geldings. But I think you can mix them, but you just have to watch the dynamics because it may not be as cohesive.
Sure. I think that's a theme across our podcast is each horse is an individual and you have
Hmm.
to monitor your own horse's response.
Hmm.
So we're coming to the end of our time, and I have one question that I ask all of my guests, and that would be, what is one common misconception that you hear about horse herd dynamics?
Um, I think if I were to offer some advice on herd dynamics, it would be for anyone that has a lesson program or anyone who has a program like we have where we're sending novice horse people out to a group to catch horses up, that you spend time teaching the novice person how to read body language so they don't put themselves in a situation where they could accidentally get hurt. Whether it's catching up a horse and having a dominant one just charge over the top of them and get out over the gate, whether it's feeding in a group situation, I think we need to make sure that we're teaching people how to read the horse because it's not instinctive for us to do so.
Yeah, that's such a great tip. I don't think that's something I've ever been explicitly taught. I think it's something you might gather over years of experience, but
Mhm.
such an important thing to be taught right off the bat.
Yeah, we kind of learned that through the School of Hard Knocks. But I think if you have a business and you need to keep all of your, whether it's your employees for me or students that I teach, or if you have a lessons business, if you're sending out your lessons kid to catch horses, I think that could create some liability for us if we don't have some way of showing that we've taught students how to read the body language of a horse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's even important for when you're working one-on-one with that horse.
Absolutely.
So that's all the time we have for today, but it's been awesome talking with you. I'm so glad you're able to join me.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
And thank you all for listening today. Please remember to like this podcast, subscribe, leave a review, and recommend the Stable Management Podcast to a friend.